I'll start us off and then hand it over to Alexander, who's going to be our moderator this evening. My name is Michael Wirtz, and I am the Assistant Chair of Illustration at the California College of the Arts. Welcome, everyone, to an evening with Peaches and Honey, a history of San Francisco drag. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Hyoshin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived on this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world. And we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually this evening. If you're unsure of whose land you're currently residing on, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. I'd like to thank Shyla Hamilton, the Chair of Critical Ethnic Studies, and Owen Smith, Chair of Illustration, for making this class. This is part of the Make It Queer class, making this class and this event possible. We honor the 50th anniversary of the Critical Ethnic Studies program, the only dedicated program of its kind at an arts and design college in the United States. I'd also like to thank Jackie Francis, who's here with us this evening, Chair of the Graduate Program in Visual and Critical Studies, and the President of the Board of the Queer Cultural Center. Every year, the Graduate Program in Visual and Critical Studies at CCA and the Queer Cultural Center of San Francisco collaborate to program the series Queer Conversations on Culture and the Arts. Queer Conversations on Culture and the Arts brings together locally, nationally, and globally renowned artists, writers, filmmakers, performers, and scholars for a series of conversations that discuss a broad range of LGBTQI+ topics in the humanities, architecture, design, and politics. CCA Humanities and Sciences Dean Titi Takamoto, VCS Chair Jackie Francis, and I thank the CCA Provost Office, led by Tammy Ray Carland, and QCC, led by Executive Director Natalia Vigil. We're grateful to Tammy Ray and Natalia for funding tonight's QCCA conversation with Peaches Christ and Honey Mahogany, moderated by CCA grad, fine arts alum, Alex Hernandez. Lastly, I'd like to thank the program manager for illustration, James Yu, who is here this evening helping us produce this event. There's Alexander, hello. James is a superstar. We're super lucky to work with him. We will start with a short slide presentation just to get the conversation started, and then talk until around 8 p.m., at which point we'll take questions. You can add questions in the chat function, in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll take questions for about 30 minutes. So we've got about 90 minutes together tonight. But first, allow me to introduce our panel this evening. Activist, politico, and drag queen, Honey Mahogany is a San Francisco native and a social worker by training who received her master's in social welfare from UC Berkeley. There she is. Hello, Honey.
Hi.
Looking gorgeous. Honey serves as the vice chair of the San Francisco Democratic County Central Committee.
Good job.
Thank you. Honey is also co-founder of the Compton's Transgender Cultural District, a co-owner of the Stud Bar, and currently works as a legislative aide in San Francisco. Welcome to CCA, Honey.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And Peaches Christ is a filmmaker and cult leader living in San Francisco. There she is. Hello, Peaches.
Hi.
Her infamous movie events are self-produced at the Castro Theater and regularly draw over 1,000 attendees to each new production before they tour worldwide. Peaches is also the co-owner of the Into the Dark production company, which produces immersive theater, including the hugely popular Terror Vault show at the historic San Francisco Mint Building. Welcome to CCA, Peaches.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Alexander Hernandez, one last introduction. Whew, Honey. Our moderator this evening is a mixed media artist with an emphasis in textiles. He received his BFA in painting and drawing from Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design in Denver, Colorado, and his MFA in studio art from California College of the Arts. His work explores multiple identities rooted in immigrant experiences, gender expectations, HIV positive survival, and queer sensibilities. So thanks for being here. Thanks for coming back, Alexander, to CCA.
No problem.
And go ahead and you can take it away.
Okay. So hi, everybody. I'll be the one kind of hosting and asking questions. So I'll start talking during the slide when it as soon as it starts, but I hope everyone's doing well and keeping themselves fabulous. So yeah, can we get that slide started?
Sure. There we go.
So, okay, so I mean, San Francisco has always kind of had a lot of queer people because of the Navy, but it really kind of, like all these drag communities started coming up probably around a Prohibition era. So this is when alcohol was not allowed, and Pinocchios had been around pretty much since the turn of the century, but it really wasn't until like the 30s, 40s, and 50s where they started to do drag. But it was, back then it was seen more as like a way to, it was more like a showgirl thing, and it was more like it was more for the straight people to be kind of like, ooh, I can't believe these are men. So it wasn't really, it was more for the straight people as viewerships. It really wasn't like for us, not yet anyways. That really didn't start until The Black Cat, which is gonna be around the 50s. This is where like the Bohemians kind of hung out at this bar. At first it was North Beach, and then towards the 60s, it moved into the financial district, where Jose Saria, which is the next slide, kind of started to do some drag shows. And this is actually from Pinocchio's, but this is kind of what drag was like. This is like, you know, for people to, it was just like you had watched a dinner and people would see these showgirls.
Is that Whole Lot of Times on the left?
Probably. Probably.
She did perform there.
Yes. I think this one was from the 60s.
Wow.
And then
Could be.
so
There's Jose.
and this Jose Saria, he kind of pretty much started the drag scene in Black Cat bar, which in the 60s kind of moved over to Financial District. And he was actually a pioneer in a lot of ways, because he was doing drag for the queer community. It was for us. It was, you know, for gays and trans people and everybody in between. And so he was very, he kind of started everything, because at this point it was actually illegal for people to not dress like, you know, the clothing that we're supposed to be wearing. So it was illegal for a man to wear women's clothing, because it was seen as like, you're trying to entrap men, to like, you know, you're trying to seduce men. And there was all these, you know, really backwards laws. And so he was the first person that would literally wear signs that said, I'm a man. So he kind of would play with the police, like, you can't arrest me because I'm not trying to trick anybody. And he was also the first person to run for office in San Francisco, even before Harvey Milk. So he kind of opened a lot of the doors for us. And he also started the Ducal Court, which still runs till today. And I think, it's Honey, are you in the Ducal Court? Or
I think they started the Imperial Court.
Oh, the Imperial Court. My bad. Sorry, I get them confused because they're so many.
I do too. Although I'm sure there are some people in the court system that are watching this right now, and you know, I remember actually one time, Cookie Dough, who is a legend in San Francisco drag, had just won Grand Duchess, and I had told her, I remember, congratulations on being Empress, and she just looked at me and was just read me to filth, which was the first time I'd ever seen her be mean to anybody, because she's so sweet normally. So after that, I tried to really get it straight, but honestly, unless you're in the system, it's kind of confusing. And I think actually the Ducal Court came out of the Imperial Court because there was some shady things that happened in the Imperial Court.
Of course, there's always drama with queens, of course.
Always drama.
And then when we see in the next slide, this is like one of her, actually, I don't know if it's her, Jose. And not only that, but he he kind of like created myths about his persona. Like he had, for example, he was the Nightingale of Montgomery Street, but then he also created another persona called the Widow Norton, and he had all these stories about like being married to somebody, to some kind of emperor, and so that's kind of why that whole imperial thing started, is because nobody knows if he was actually dating somebody that was in royalty that supposedly he met during World War II. So like and then here he is in the 60s. And he kind of, like I was saying, this is during the time in the 60s where queer people were being comfortable, admitting that they were gay. And so he actually would sing like, God Saved Us Nelly Queens. And so this is the first time that you really see like sing-alongs. You see people together. And then next slide. And so, and then this is kind of like, and then this is kind of where drag starts to slowly move into Polk Street. So around like, towards the end of the 60s, 70s. And this is also when the Compton cafeteria riots happened. And this is also, we kind of see a difference because the Finocchio queens are still working at this time, but they're kind of like, the tier, like they're like celebrities. And then you had all these trans people and drag queens that kind of didn't really have enough money. And a lot of them had to be sex workers to make money. And so they would go to Compton's cafeteria, which I think is in the next slide. They would go to eat, but the police would literally like come and just like pick on them. And so one night in, actually, I think it was 1966, they just like, they had a really long night and they just started throwing stuff at the police officers. And it kind of, it's one of those things that kind of gets lost in history because nobody really wrote about it. It wasn't really until much later that kind of people reflected that this happened even before Stonewall. And it was mostly, I think it was also kind of forgotten because these were kind of like, sex work, like people, I think we were still trying to like figure out the community, like ourselves as well, because gay men were still very, very racist and even like sexist towards the trans sisters and towards people of color. So people were still kind of, it took a minute for us to kind of come along. And so everybody kind of hung in a tenderloin around this time. And then slowly, and you can see on this next slide, I think, is when we started to kind of move towards Polk Street. And then eventually we got to the Coquettes, this is late 60s, like when the hippies were a big thing and the hate. And then they kind of really got big in the 70s. And this is really like one of the main, like, things about drag from San Francisco is that they started to play with gender and kind of like blurring a lot of the things. And then Sylvester was part of it. So I mean, this is the first time we see like bearded queens. We see not only that, but we also see like cis women doing drag, which and there was even like kids, like they were pretty much in a commune. And so this is really like where like a lot of the SF drag kind of like is different than where, anything else in New York and LA. And so they were actually brought over to New York to do a play, but it just didn't translate. And this is kind of how they kind of got separated, is because they thought they were going to be big during the show they were going to have in New York, but they were all like so high and so like doing their own thing that they never practiced for this play. And then so it was kind of a big flop. And so they just came back to San Francisco and kind of, went back into, and then there's Sylvester again. And not only that, but after the Coquettes kind of, their play in New York didn't work well, Sylvester was kind of gaining fame from his singing, and they kind of told them, okay, you kind of can't be associated with them because they weren't really doing well.
Yeah. Can I just pop in and say that
Yeah.
I heard that it was actually at that performance that the Coquettes bombed in New York specifically because they were partying out all night.
Yeah.
Before. And at their debut, they were just completely hungover, and New York audiences weren't having it because they're used to Broadway, they're used to polished, they're used to like a certain level of performance. And the Cockettes went out there, did their thing, were super messy. Someone probably spilled some poppers on the stage, and then afterwards, Sylvester was also there, and he went up there and kind of looked at them and was like, y'all, I'm so sorry you had to witness that. And slayed it, honey. And he got a standing ovation. And it was after that he was just like, sorry, I can't be associated with you anymore. And went off on his own and became a big old star.
And I think that's also like one thing that like makes us different from other cities is that we're very like DIY, we're very like sloppy, and like sometimes, not always, but like we're very we can be, but you know what I mean, like we're very like create your own thing, and we're always late, and people in New York and other cities are always on time, like they're all about so I think that's one thing that kind of where we get all our information from is from around this time. Okay, and then this is actually one of the first parades, and this is on Polk Street. So Polk Street was pretty much kind of like the gay area right before all the gays started buying houses in the Castro, because this is the time where gay people were starting to settle down and they wanted to kind of be a little heteronormative. So they started buying all these houses in the Castro because a lot of the boomers at the time had like gone to college or they like went to work. And so there were all these people, there were all these houses kind of like just left alone with older people that just like, they didn't even know they wanted to stay. So gay people started to buy, and that's to buy the Castro. And this is why the Castro is what it is today. It's because they wanted to kind of set up like a gay suburb.
Can I, sorry, is it okay if I hop in?
Go for it. No, because definitely.
This was also the time when they had a huge white flight to the suburbs, because this is also around the same time as desegregation was happening. And so people didn't feel comfortable having their children go to schools in the same school district as colored children. And so they all left for the suburbs, and that created a huge amount of availability for the gay community to then move in and sort of take over all those Victorians that were left empty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's okay. And then what's the next slide? And then the 80s. Well, and then since we're talking about racism a little bit right here, actually, so there was a Latin bar called Esta Noche that originally wanted to open up in the Castro because they were like, hey, we want to open this gay bar. But the story goes that the owner said, well, we don't really want that kind of music here. Like, we don't know, like, they didn't want some of that Spanish music here. So they ended up opening a gay bar in the Mission, which is the Latin area of the city. And so Esta Noche kind of had its own thing. And what made it really interesting is that a lot of it had, regional and like very Spanish ballads. It was a totally different drag scene. It was kind of like its own little universe. And then also around the corner, I forgot to get a picture, but also there was a lesbian bar a few blocks away, the Lexington. There was another queer bar. And so we can kind of see that, like, even though we're all in this together, there still was a lot of racism within the community. And so that's why a lot of subcultures came about because of that. And then in the 80s, also, like, people like Doris Fisher, did I say right?
Doris Fish.
Doris Fish. There's a lot of queens that were moving in here from other cities. She was Australian. So a lot of people found different opportunities in San Francisco. And that's kind of something that's happened a lot is, I moved here from Colorado. I'm sure other people have moved here from other places, but a lot of people have seen SF as a way to like start over and start to experiment. And that's also why San Francisco has gotten all these different types of drags, because you can kind of tell like the difference between Castro drag and like Soma drag. And then Doris also, and you can kind of, and she started doing some movies too, right?
Yeah, so this is actually a picture of Tippy and Miss X, and this is a still from the epic sci-fi adventure they made, Vegas in Space, which this poster is actually from and was created and designed by Michael Wirtz, who introduced us all at the beginning of the show. So I thought this would be appropriate to have for an evening like this. But for me personally, the Coquettes especially, and Doris Fish, Tippy, Miss X, the people that did Vegas in Space, their radical ideas about drag were the closest thing to the Dreamlanders. I moved here from Maryland. So the Dreamlanders are the Baltimore John Waters Divine crew. And Divine and Mink Stole actually used to fly out and perform with the Coquettes. We talk about how revolutionary San Francisco drag is. I think it's important to, of course, mention the Coquettes, but the Coquettes often get the most attention because they had that beautiful, wonderful documentary made about them. But I want to see a documentary made about the making of Vegas in Space, because this whole story is epic and fantastic. And it was drag that's really ahead of its time.
Right. And actually, I think I have a poster of it right here. Yeah.
There
So
it
that's,
is, yeah.
is that what your poster is based on?
Kind of, yeah. There was some, I sat in front of the TV and used my camera and took some snaps. Yeah, sure. But yeah, the definitely the color scheme, right? That crazy neon.
And then, well, and unfortunately, towards the end of the 80s and shortly after Doris finishes her movie, she unfortunately dies from AIDS, because a lot of queens and a lot of gay people and queer people were dealing with that at the time. And so, so at this time, there was like kind of like a weird time during the 80s and 90s where like people were kind of didn't know what was going to happen, and so drag was kind of made as a way to deal with it, you know. And so out of that, I think I got this picture out of order, but the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence kind of come out of because they wanted to do something. They wanted to do fundraising and events to help people that were dying from AIDS, and this is where activism kind of starts. And then I think in the next slide, I think is
there they
yeah,
are.
there she
Yeah,
is.
Sister Roma.
I don't know if I don't think she's one of the originals, is she? Or
she is pretty much one of the originals. I mean, she was there at the very beginning. I do, if I can, go back and say some context for the sisters, because the first time that they actually, the way that they started was as a counter protest. I mean, we even till this day have, well, back then the Castro was just becoming sort of world famous for being a queer district, right? And so proselytizers and, you know, people would be on the corners yelling like, Jesus loves you, you know, and so a bunch of people were like, oh, let's go dress up as nuns and just like counter protest. So a horde of, you know, a gaggle of gays got together, dressed up as nuns, and went and harassed and chased away those protesters. And they had such a good time doing it that they started to do it regularly, and quickly sort of started this nunhood with an order that had all these rules, and you know, you had to become a postulant, and it's actually very, very strict and hard and rigorous to become a sister, because they take it seriously, because they are a big fundraising organization, like you said, and do a lot of good community work. But the thing that they, I think, are credited for, which is really important, is that they created the first ever safe sex pamphlet at the height of the AIDS epidemic or HIV crisis, before people even knew like what caused AIDS. Back when they were calling it GRID. So they have a really, I think, important, they are an important part of gay and queer history in general. And they did start in San Francisco, and now they have chapters all over the world.
Right. And till this day, they're still they're pretty much in charge of like Folsom Street, right?
Yes.
So
Easter's still happening.
Oh yeah, and the Easter, they have a lot of events that are like very like it's very San Francisco.
Yeah. Well, and I should clarify, because I know Folsom Street Events is its own organization, and they do Folsom, but they oftentimes are the ones running the door or being at the door and collecting those donations. And then
kind of like the face.
That's right. They manage the gates. So they are literally the gatekeepers for Folsom Street there. And for many, many years, they ran Pink Saturday until it was overrun with trash. And it got violent, and the
Great people came.
folks came in, the gawkers came in to beat up the gays, and that's literally what happened to Halloween as well.
Yep.
But the sisters, when they very, very first started, what's really interesting is it was just men, like without the makeup or anything, and they'd wear the habits and the wimples and the long. I love in Tales of the City because they were formed in the late 70s. And if you see Tales of the City, the movie, there's that great scene where the sisters all go roller skating by, but they're not in the makeup and stuff. That happened more in the early 80s. You see it more with New Wave, and when Sister Roma was coming in, and the Vegas and Space people. Obviously, drag here, it's a small town, so we all borrow from each other, we all share. Yes. And so the early version of the sisters were like dudes, like Castro clones with beards and stuff, wearing habits. But then over time, they've started to develop this sort of clown white makeup, which also is unique to San Francisco. Some places don't do the San Francisco style makeup. So when you go travel around the world, you'll see all different kinds of styles. I once got to introduce the Paris sisters, les Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. And they are, no offense, San Francisco sisters, but those Parisian nuns are on point, okay? Like flawless outfits, exquisite makeup. They're just not sloppy.
There's some Kylie's dropping some amazing knowledge in the chat, by the way.
Kylie is an angel.
Yeah, the three original sisters
know it all.
Yeah.
And then I think I have another picture. Do I have another picture from? Oh, and then actually we get to the stud. So I think the stud has been around since the 70s, right?
No, same year as the Compton's cafeteria, right? 1966 when it was open.
But was it in the 80s and the, well, a lot of these places have been open, but it kind of seems like their like heyday kind of changes a little bit. But I think, did the stud get kind of really big in the 80s and 90s because of Tranny Shack, or T-Shack?
Well, so Tranny Shack did happen, or T-Shack happened in the 90s, but the stud, has been around since 66, and even back then it was kind of the place to be. Etta James actually used to perform at the stud back in the 60s and 70s.
Wow.
It's also another thing, like the sisters, that's featured in Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City. So I love that era, where these things that we love so much today, I think if you're queer and you're San Franciscan and you don't love the Stud Bar or the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, you should just move, but those things have been around for decades, but the stud, as Honey, I'm sure can tell us more about, but it wasn't at the 9th and Harrison location. It was actually where Holy Cow is now.
Mm-hmm. It was there. Mm-hmm. It was there until, I believe, so it was there for about 28 years, almost 30 years. And then in the late 80s, I believe, is when it moved to the 9th and Harrison location. But a cool thing about the stud, just because we were talking about, racial justice and things like that, is it actually, in the 60s, when it first was opening, it started out as a leather bar, or they tried to make it a leather bar because it was a part of that part of San Francisco. Soma, the Miracle Mile, all the leather bars were there, very butch, masculine scene, but very quickly, it turned out that it was just not meant to be that. And quickly, Hair Fairy started to go there. They started playing different kinds of music, more experimental music. And pretty soon it became a place that I think a lot of people of all different types came to party. And it's the thing that I wanted to mention is that at that time, there was the Gay Liberation Front that was very active and fighting for gay rights. But at the same time, we were also having the Black Panther Party in Oakland, and this Black Civil Rights Movement was also happening, as well as the women's movement. And there were leaders at that time who were calling for a more intersectional movement, very much like the moment that we find ourselves in now. And when the Huey Newton, who was one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, really called for reaching out across to the Gay Liberation Front, the first place that they decided to meet was at the Stud Bar on Folsom Street. So I personally am very proud of that history, and I think it speaks to sort of the richness of San Francisco's legacy of anti-racism work and also intersectionality and diversity.
Right. Thank you. No, that was a lot of information that you just can't find. But yeah, so I mean, and I think we kind of also noticed that there's different types of, like, Soma drag is so much more different than like Castro drag, because this is in Soma, right? And so do you know when Hamburger Mary's started there at all?
So Hamburger Mary's actually used to be right across the street from the Stud when it was on Folsom.
Right.
And so that was back, and actually, fun fact is that they were sort of owned by the same person, and people would go back and forth between the bars. And in fact, I feel like the person who owned it at that point, their name was Heidi, and in fact, our legal sort of LLC is still to this day Handsome Heidi. Another fun fact about the Stud, though, at some point, one of the owners ended up transitioning, and so was a trans woman, and ended up also owning the Holy Cow after the Stud left. So one of the first sort of like bars that was owned by an openly trans woman was also the Stud.
Awesome. And then,
I'd love to hear more later about like the future of the Stud.
Yeah, because
we can get into that maybe after slides, but yeah, I'd love to hear about like how we can help keep the Stud alive and keep that spirit going.
And then can we go to the next?
Whoopsie, there we go.
Wait, Heclina, that's right. I was having a brain. But yeah, but Heclina really kind of started T-Shack, right? And this is kind of where we get the very, very kind of crazy drag, and kind of like what people like when people wanted to see shocking performances. Usually it was at the Stud when Heclina was hosting it. And I know that like even people have told me like there was always like some kind of theme every night, like during the 90s. Like, there would be a Bjork night, or there was even like a David Lynch night, somebody told me. And I find, and it's funny that, and that's what I love about San Francisco, is that there's always something, like a Monday or Tuesday, there was always like, whether it's bingo or karaoke, there's always some kind of gay related thing happening in the city. And when I went to Boston, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna pay $1,000 more to live in San Francisco. Because there's nothing happening in Boston on a Wednesday night.
Yeah, when you consider that T-Shack, when I moved to San Francisco in 1996, was a cabaret night on a Tuesday, and the show started at midnight, but it was really drag time, right? And that it became a massive hit. But it wasn't just T-Shack happening at the Stud, it was all sorts of things. There was a club there. I mean, for my little, I was fresh off the bus, and I arrived in Oz. There was a club called Club Jesus at the Stud, and I'll never forget seeing a woman light her tits on fire, like it was nothing, and go-go dancers dressed as Jesus, and that was just one of the many clubs that was at the Stud, and that was produced by Paul King and all the sort of piercing and fetish folks. It was a wild, wild time. And you didn't really go out on the weekends because it wasn't that cool. It was considered bridge and tunnel. So the real locals, we went out on weekdays,
Right.
Yeah.
For the longest time, the Stud had a furry party that was there forever.
I remember. Yeah. I think the Stud in general, whether it was at T-Shack or wherever, is where so many of us that maybe didn't fit into the Castro, found our home and really found the sort of diversity we were looking for. I mean, I moved to San Francisco so I could meet all different kinds of people. And I got to meet those people and become friends with them at the Stud, through T-Shack for sure, but everything else. And Alexander, what you were saying about the theme nights, that was all by accident. Heclina had started T-Shack with Pippi Lovestocking.
Oh my God.
It was actually called Singing for Your Suppers, and it was a karaoke night, and they were doing it as a fundraiser. But Pippi went in and moved into this biodome where she lived with strangers for a few months and had a regulated diet, and they analyzed her shit, and she was gone. And so Heclina decided while Pippi was gone, okay, I guess I'll just have a different co-hostess come in every week. And that co-hostess then could do some sort of theme, and they centered the themes around the co-hostess. And that became the winning model that then every drag show in town to this day, pretty much emulates, which is, and that was all by accident, but it was a perfect magical recipe because you never got bored. If David Lynch wasn't your thing, maybe you skipped that Tuesday, but you were going to show up the next week because it was heavy metal night, with Metal Patricia, or whatever. And that whole, the credit does go to Heclina, and poor Pippi, she came out of the biodome, and T-Shack was a huge success, and Heclina said, sorry, you left.
And that's also why
still waiting for her checks.
She really is bitter about it, yeah.
And that's also why like Soma has always been kind of the place that I went to, because I want to be around bears. It's kind of where you went to hang out with punks. Like you kind of only go to the Castro like when your sister's in town.
Well, and there was also Planet Big, which was at the stud for years as well. That was a huge bear party. I mean, I think that and early on, the stud actually had a placard that hung above the door that said "Everyone is welcome." And I think whether you were a woman or a man or trans or a fairy or a leather daddy or a bear or a twink, people I think found community there, and that's and
it was always reflected in its staff as well. The staff was completely diverse, young, old, men, women, trans folks, drag performers, tattooed muscle daddies. It was always, it almost seemed like it came natural to. Now I knew the stud mostly during its, Michael days, where Michael was the owner. But Michael very much had an everyone is welcome attitude, and it does start from the top, And so I think in many ways, Michael deserves a lot of credit for creating that space and inviting almost anyone to come there and do what they wanted to do,
Absolutely.
Maybe now's a good time to add that we have a couple questions, but one of them is, let's go ahead and talk about the future of the stud bar, Honey, if you would. If like where is it at now, and where do we hope it's going to be?
Sure. I mean, we are in a bit of a holding pattern. We still have shows. We have a Twitch channel, Drag Alive, and we host other shows there as well. So in terms of, I think, creating space and creating content, I think we're still doing that. And then we have a podcast that we do currently as well, where we actually, our first year, we did one a month, was all about looking back at the history of the stud and its connections to different queer bars, queer people, queer movements. Really fascinating. We did a whole episode on Etta James, a whole episode on Sylvester, a whole episode on the stud sort of linked to Lexington. And then we have our merchandise, which I think is really cool and hot right now. So if you want to support the stud, you can go and buy some merchandise. We're doing all of that and trying to fundraise so that we can eventually find our forever home. Unfortunately, I think Michael was able to do all of those crazy things and let people do whatever they want and try things that may or may not be successful because his rent was so low. And then unfortunately, when the owner passed away and the building got sold, all of a sudden the building owner was like, oh no, you all are, we're going to triple the rent. And so and I think Michael at that point was just kind of exhausted, and also his mother wasn't doing well at that time. So he kind of made a decision to leave. But he really wanted to transfer it into the community's hands. He didn't want to see the stud die. And that's when a collective of us, 18 of us at the time, kind of came together and created the Stud Collective and did it sort of a collective operating, like running the bar, cleaning the bar, booking the bar, hosting the shows effort. We did the best that we could, I think. And I think we were successful. We didn't make a lot of money, but that was never our goal. Our goal was really to continue the legacy of the stud and continue to create space for our friends and performers, and to a space to create art. But unfortunately, when COVID happened, we quickly saw that we were going to become, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, which we would be by now if we had continued to stay there. And so we made the decision to exit our lease at that time. And the thing was, our lease was only for a year. Each year we had to fight to get our lease extended another year, and our rent kept going up actually on a monthly basis. So it was becoming more and more intangible. And I think it was really clear that they wanted us to leave so that they could do something else with the bar. And so we now are, I think, very much committed to finding a new space. We've never stopped looking for a new space. We've done that for the last 3 years. I think we're figuring that out now. We're still looking, but we're very much committed to reopening, hopefully in Soma. There's a couple options on the table that we're looking at, crossing our fingers, hoping that they work out. But
me too. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. There's a couple questions here from Marion as well, and we'll get to those, but maybe Marion, we'll get to your questions very soon. But I want to get through the photos so that we can get to full screen and then ask questions. Okay. So yes, there's some comments too about there. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in Peaches, like, around what time did you move to the Bay Area? And you kind of started a whole different, like, you're kind of like, a mainstay of some, you're like a new chapter.
Yes, I've been around a long time. So I moved in 1996, and that was the same year that T-Shack started, and I started performing there, and obviously became, I tease Heckelina. We tease each other a lot, which is a drag tradition, but you only tease the people you love. And she and I became very close pretty early on, and the whole T-Shack scene, all those people became creative collaborators. We were inspired by one another. And one thing I'll say about San Francisco drag that I do think is different than other drag scenes, we weren't really competitive in a way that meant we weren't happy for others. We would see someone like the Steve lady do a number and then go, oh my God, that was amazing. I want to do that. And so we all kind of helped raise the bar. And T-Shack helped me launch my midnight movie show called Midnight Mass, and that was in 1998. And then Heckelina and I have really worked together ever since. We don't do everything together. We're not officially in a business. I have Peaches Christ Productions, and she has her businesses. But we really have been kind of a duo. But it's the same thing with a lot of the queens of our generation, Juanita Moore, Sister Roma, myself, Heckelina. We've always supported one another over the years and had each other's backs. And I think that that's one of the bits of advice I like to give young queens is, save your bitchy, catty comments for the stage. But when you're off stage, those are your sisters, and all boats rise together. So, that I've been very lucky to have a village of wonderful friends, including Honey, many people who work in all these different, fields all around town and in different communities, but we all overlap,
Right. And and I see that a lot, because when Esta Noche was closing down, you and other people were trying to help it stay up. So I noticed, there was a lot of intersectionality that happens in SF, and people try to help each other out. And this is Esta Noche closing. Like, this is probably them starting to close in like the late 2010s, right? I forget exactly when they closed. But I was also going to say that Peaches, you kind of revitalized the Castro in a way, because it was your movie screenings that kind of changed the events.
Well, I can't take credit for that, because the Castro has always been, the Castro. And while I think there are arguments to be made for the sort of squareness of the Castro and certainly the whiteness of the Castro. You know, Marlon Riggs made this incredible film in the early 80s called Tongues Untied. And it's about being a Black man, you know, gay Black man walking through the Castro. And sadly, that sort of Castro clone idea was still around, you know, through the 80s. I will say that, you know, living in the Castro, working in the Castro, that is not the case anymore. You know, young queer kids of color have taken over, and it's a wonderful thing to see, you know. And if you go down there now, the diversity of people waiting to get into Beau or, you know, the cafe or whatever, it's really shifted. The dynamic has shifted, and it's a really great thing to see. I just happen to benefit from being able to do my shows in perhaps the best movie theater in the world, but it was the best movie theater in the world before I got in there, you know. And it is to me the sort of the shining gem of that neighborhood is that cinema, which, talk about intersectionality, that movie theater brings the entire Bay Area to that neighborhood, because culturally the San Francisco International Film Festival, the Jewish Film Festival, the Arab Film Festival, you know, it's an incredible, of course, Frameline, which is the biggest queer film festival and oldest queer film festival in the world. So the Castro is still a very, very important place. I think it's, when we're talking about drag, and we may mention the Castro in maybe what seems like a disparaging way, and in no way, shape, or form should we undervalue the importance of that neighborhood or the community. But also, you know, Cookie Dough, I have to say, she took a lot of inspiration from Heclina and went over to the Castro. And if you've attended the Monster Show, especially when Cookie Dough did it, you know, it was as weird and twisted, and I mean, it was bizarre, you know. So Cookie really deserves a lot of credit for bringing that sort of Soma sensibility into the Castro.
And yeah, she made Thursday nights pretty much like a month.
But even wasn't before that, wasn't she doing merry-go-round with Spaz, and then there was somebody else who switched. It was, I know, a whole lot of times at one point, but it was somebody else as well. Was that before or after merry-go-round or Monster Show?
I'm not sure, but I do think that there was this period where the drag sort of the concepts around what drag could be were different depending on what neighborhood you were in. Certainly, if you performed at Marlena's, I remember I performed at Marlena's in Hayes Valley once, and Marlena told me, "Don't do any of that blood shit." You know, and I remember being like, I won't, you know. But I kind of loved that I was on stage at Marlena's, where many of the Imperial Court people performed. And maybe one of my most favorite queens of all time, Nikki Starr, was a headliner there, and she performed there every week. And I would go see Nikki Starr, who would do basically the same number week after week, but I loved it. And she was amazing. And she'd do a gospel number finale and run out onto Hayes Street and get the whole neighborhood worked up. The fact is, we did all kind of populate each other's clubs. Now, I could never perform at Esta Noche because there was sort of, I mean, it wasn't an unspoken rule. It was a pretty obvious rule that, you know, white girls didn't perform there. And I loved that. And I loved going to see shows there, you know, so we did support each other's stuff. And I think that sort of idea about what Castro drag is kind of went out the window when Soma drag basically kind of influenced. Yeah, it kind of influenced everything.
Right, it did. And then something that I was going to talk about too, that I kind of added towards the end of the slide, is kind of, there's some houses, right, in San Francisco. Yeah. This is the house of Moore, Juanita Moore, and Dulce de Leche.
Mm-hmm. And Glamamore, who's, you know, the Juanita Moore, Glamamore. There's Juanita and Honey. Juanita. Yeah. Now, Honey, are you in the House of Moore?
In a way, yes. I am. I'm a kind of adjacent, but it's Glamma Moore is my wicked stepmother. My official drag mother is Katya Smirnovskaya, who's also adjacent. Which, because Katya Smirnovskaya is my mother, her drag mother is actually Nikki Starr. So Nikki Starr is my drag grandmother.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nikki
So
Starr had an amazing drag family. Nikki Starr, for those of you who don't know, she was the winner of the second annual T-Shack. And I think in a way, her winning that contest was very emblematic of what T-Shack could be, which was anything. Because you had an older Black queen from the imperial court who was basically best known for gospel numbers, and she was incredible. And she won the second pageant at, of the punk rock, Blood and Guts Club. But a lot of people don't know this. Nikki Starr was actually Heclena's drag mother. And one of the things about Nikki Starr that I think is so amazing is, I'm going to make this story really short. I once was invited to have a lunch with Holly Woodlawn, the famous Warhol actress, legendary Andy Warhol actress, and they filmed us at the Neiman Marcus Rotunda, the big fancy restaurant. It was me and Juanita Moore and a bunch of like San Francisco luminaries. Nikki was there. And so it was obvious that Holly and Nikki knew each other for years. And as they're talking, I start to figure out that Holly and Nikki knew each other so well that Holly starts to tell us, did you all know that Nikki cut Andy's first wig? And we're like, what? And Nikki's like, yeah. So Nikki Starr put Andy Warhol in a wig for the first time. Then they're talking about Glenn this, Glenn that. I'm like, do you mean Glenn Milstead Divine? Oh yeah, girl. I mean, so there were legends walking amongst us who didn't feel the need to tell us how legendary they were. I had to find out from Holly Woodlawn that Nikki Starr was like fucking legendary, in a way, so talk about humility, what drag queen wouldn't brag about creating Andy Warhol's wig?
she was really special.
Yeah, she was amazing.
I do want to say, if we're talking about queens who changed the Castro, that Juanita Moore is definitely one of the people who did that.
Yeah.
Her parties, Booty Call Wednesdays, which happened at, God, I forget what was Q Bar, but before that it was Bar on Castro. Before that it was something else. Really brought a whole POCs and gender variant club kid scene to the Castro, where I think before and even at the same time, really anywhere else, it was very much sort of Castro clone culture. So that to me, I think that was also my comeuppance in drag, was around the same time that Juanita was, actually it was before it was there, she was doing stuff at the Transfer. But in any case, it was still Castro adjacent, and then it moved to Bar on Castro, and it completely changed the scene. And she's still, I think, doing that today. I think she's just so forward thinking and such a genius in her own right. And now she's running for the Imperial Court. I actually think that Juanita Moore is sort of the Jose Sarria of our time.
Right.
Yeah.
Can anyone vote for that? How is that run? I'm curious about how
You have to be a resident of San Francisco.
Okay. But all you folks listening right now, you can vote for Juanita. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah.
She's a good DJ too.
Grandma Moore is also running, so they're running together. So just
right.
FYI.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's an empress, but also an emperor.
Oh, okay, yeah. So Glenma Moore's running for emperor. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, great.
That's me.
And then towards this, I was gonna, now that we're talking about Juanita Moore and we're talking about you, Peaches, about how I feel like a lot of these drag queens kind of become these powerhouses. They kind of have, and not only that, but they kind of have all these layers of jobs. Like Juanita DJs, you host your movie nights. Honey does a lot of her events at the Stud. Like it's kind of like amazing how you all kind of like can turn this into like a sustainable thing. Like, can you kind of share how you make this kind of lifestyle sustainable? Because I mean, for me as an artist, it almost feels like being an artist, like you kind of have to find your followers, right? You have to have a following. You kind of have to always be PR marketing yourself. You kind of have to, well, you obviously have to sell yourself, but also you kind of have to figure ways to make money. Like, how do you sustain these things? Because sometimes you don't make, money from your craft until much later, and after you've kind of, established yourself. What are some things that you kind of suggest to maybe people that want to go into drag or related.
Okay, I have a lot of answers for this, and honey, please feel free to jump in. But one thing I'll say, uh, God bless Honey Mahogany for being the first girl from San Francisco to get on RuPaul's Drag Race. And I love RuPaul's Drag Race, and I'm friends with lots of girls who are on Drag Race. However, I think Drag Race in many ways has given this sort of false narrative to a lot of young queens that it's somehow the way to go in order to have a career in drag or to become, rich and famous as a drag performer. I would recommend that you not aspire to that and do drag because you love to do drag. And most of us from my generation, actually started drag despite the fact that it was not popular. Gay people did not like it. We were not embraced. Maybe in some ways, the fact that our shows were punk rock and angry and bloody and gory is a reflection of, how we felt. And so I had to have a job. I had to work. And in many ways, doing Peaches was a liability. I spent more money being Peaches than I made. So for many, many years, it was nothing but a labor of love, despite all odds. I named myself something that my parents didn't particularly care for. I was an angry Catholic kid, but I loved it. It was my inner sissy, my femme identity getting to perform herself, and celebrate the things I love. And much like Honey, I was able to take other things that I loved and integrate them into Peaches and build this weird kind of amalgamation of a world, that involved, celebrating movies, making movies, doing stage shows about movies, and it worked. And Honey, she knows I am so in awe of what she has done as an activist, and being the San Francisco girl to go on Drag Race and come off of it and not really exploit the television moment she had for fame and fortune, but to create change in our community, to create the transgender district, to change our city for the better. Like, I love you for that, Honey. I think it's amazing. I also think it's very San Franciscan. It's very San Franciscan for Honey to go, hey, I was a social worker before I got on this show. Now I have a name. Now I have a platform. I have an audience. I know what I'm going to do. And I think that is what we've done well. Juanita Moore, Sister Roma, Heclina, certainly, and Honey and I were recently talking about other queens that came before us, like Doris Fish, also Joan Jett Black, who ran for president as a drag queen, in San Francisco, and had a very famous poster, around town for many years, that was, I guess, a parody of a Black Panther's, famous image. But in many ways, I don't know if it was that much of a parody,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with Peaches 100%. The way that I did it, I was performing like probably 5 or 6 nights a week, just because there were that many drag shows, and it was something that I needed to do. And I remember very clearly like being in grad school and doing all these drag shows and like falling asleep at my internship because I was so exhausted. And something I couldn't control almost, like I had this need to be there and be on stage and be with those freaks, and having a good time. I didn't really make money until I got on Drag Race, and then for the other side of it, like Drag Race does allow you, I think, to have a career where you are dedicating your time to drag. I agree with Peaches. I don't think that's the only way. I don't think it's the most likely way. And I also don't think it's the most fun way to do it. I think that if you're going to do drag, you have to really love it. And I 100% also agree with her point that there was a time when drag queens were considered like the bane of the gay community, except for when they needed to raise some funds. And then all of a sudden porn stars and drag queens were called to like raise all this money. And then as soon as we were done raising money, it was like, please go back under the rug. We want to get gay marriage. So I believe that you have to just sort of like earn your dues a little bit, kind of cut your teeth and do it because you love it, and not try and imitate something that is on television. Because even if you look at Drag Race as an example, a lot of times it's those queens who are unique and who aren't sort of cut from the same cloth as everyone else that actually make it very far and actually make a name for themselves. So, just do you. One thing that I will say about RuPaul's Drag Race and how it's impacted drag is that I really appreciated before how drag was really different in every city. Like beyond San Francisco in and of itself had very many drag scenes that were not very homogenous. But really when you would go to different parts of the country, the drag looked so different. The makeup was different. The way that people performed was different. The culture was different. And I thought that was so cool and special. And now it's become homogenized in a way. It's become a little more Teflon and a little there's a certain level of polished but also consistency and a certain look that is expected, and I don't think that that's always the best thing. I kind of miss the diversity that we used to have in the scene.
I like to say that sadly drag has become the pumpkin latte of gay culture. And I know that makes me sound like a bitter old queen, and I don't care. So I feel like this. The challenge is not to do a drag character based on 1,000 YouTube tutorials, but to sit and be sloppy and messy and creative and, express yourself and come up with something new. And, the thing is, yes, it's hard to come up with something new, but when we've got this many people looking exactly alike and doing the same kind of thing because of a TV show and the internet, and it's not Drag Race's fault, it's just that it's popular, then it's almost like you have no excuse for not standing out and doing something crazy weird.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that I grew up in the San Francisco drag scene and specifically in Soma and had people like Suppository Spelling as one of my mentors and Glamour as one of my mentors, because I think that it definitely pushed me to be a better performer. It pushed me out of my comfort zone in a way that I do think one thing about drag and performing in general is it teaches you so many lessons that carry on to other parts of your life. I think a lot of moments where I've had to have courage and do all these different things are because of me pushing myself within the drag scene and just learning so much from this incredible group of people. So even though I look like this, I am a Soma queen at heart and will always be.
Yeah, you're too pretty.
Too pretty, too real.
Exactly.
There's a couple questions. Maybe we could.
Yeah. I mean, you
to
pretty
some
much
of
answered most of
those.
the questions throughout the slide, so that's perfect. But actually, this question by Maria Guerra kind of coincides with the last question I had. Is what does the future of drag look like in San Francisco? Especially because gentrification. And Maria asks, have any of you or your drag sisters been affected by the gentrification of the city due to tech companies moving in?
Yeah, there are so many people that have moved out of San Francisco.
Yeah.
I mean, San Francisco has hemorrhaged queens and artists. A lot of the people that I grew up in the scene have moved to places like LA or Austin or
Palm Springs.
Or where?
Palm Springs.
Okay, well.
So many, but they're my age, honey. Your friends, they're not ready. Your peers aren't ready for Palm Springs yet.
One day I'll be there too, or Guerneville.
Yeah.
But I mean that it's true. Like drag was already sort of inaffordable. It was a lot of people. Most of us did not have money and were just doing it because we loved it. And I think unfortunately, it's becoming less possible to do that. I think luckily, people are also making more money doing drag now. I think RuPaul's Drag Race has also done that, because even if you're not a RuPaul's Drag Race queen, you can go and perform at a viewing party and make a ton of money in tips, which did not always used to be the case. Remember when it was a big deal if you walked away with $30, except for Marlena's, which somehow had a ton of money. Like people made bank at Marlena's. It absolutely has impacted our community, and I'm interested to see what happens after COVID, because there have been so many changes. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like there has been a huge drop in rents. And as much as people want to say that San Francisco is dead and that tech is now going to flee the city, actually one of the, no, not one of, the largest real estate deal in San Francisco's history happened just a few weeks ago. I forget which company bought like 12 billion or something dollars of real estate in downtown San Francisco, but I don't think that the tech industry is going anywhere. And it's something that we're going to have to continue pushing back on. I think that's why we also founded the cultural districts, right? Is to sort of stem the tide of gentrification. And we acknowledge that neighborhoods change, cities change, and that's not always a bad thing. And raising the standard of living for people, especially people who are poor, is not a bad thing, but we have to provide protections, and we have to invest in affordable options for housing, and we have to preserve our cultural institutions and the things that are special about our neighborhoods, that are the entire reason that people are coming to San Francisco in the first place. So I do think that there is hope. I think there are a lot of initiatives on the ballot. I think that we need to continue to elect progressive leaders to our city to fight for these things. But yes, absolutely, we have been impacted by the gentrification of San Francisco.
I have to say, I disagree with Honey just a little bit, just a tiny bit. And it's because I tend to be, I don't know, like this is something Heclina and I sometimes disagree on. I'm constantly an optimist, even when I shouldn't be. And I have noticed that rents are dropping. And if you look, especially on Facebook Marketplace and things, like I live in Hayes Valley, and what's available now in Hayes Valley, like studios and one bedrooms, are drastically different prices than they were before the pandemic. And so my hope is, and a lot of tech companies have said this, that they're not going to send people back to work, that they have recognized that they don't need to have people in the Bay Area working. And so there has been a mass exodus of tech people. Many, many tech people have actually moved to other states where they don't have to pay as much income tax. And this is just what's happening, you know, for sure. And so my hope is that this sort of tech bubble might be burst here because tech realizes that it can spread out all over the place. And recognize too that tech people aren't awful, terrible people. You know, there was a lot of positive things that have come for a lot of us with the money that was brought in. And a lot of the negative things have outweighed the positive, unfortunately, especially for us queer artists and drag performers and people who want to live in a diverse, you know, city. And I think maybe with the devastation of this pandemic, and we're seeing it all around us, crime in San Francisco is hideous right now. The streets can be vile, you know, that this could be another opportunity for a sort of a shift, and one that's available to creative people who are willing to come here and you know, rough it with the rest of us in order to take over the empty office spaces and warehouse spaces and apartments and start to rebuild. The reality though is we're going to make it fierce again, and then, you know, it'll get gentrified all over again. But in the meantime, let's make some amazing art.
I hope so. I really hope that's true. I do. I think you're right. I do think that you're right that rents have gone down a little bit. I hope they continue to do so.
Perfect. Can you talk a little bit about your vision of queer nightlife post-pandemic, or what you think might happen? This is a question that's seldom asked in the question.
Well, I mean, I predict that we're going to see a roaring 20s, because we yearn to be around people. It is just human, and people have been trapped indoors and, you know, streaming everything on television and looking at their phones, and they're sick of it. Like, we're human beings, you know, and if the pandemic teaches us anything, it's that life is short and we need to, you know, live every day. And what you see is people are returning to nature. They're spending time in parks. They're looking for art. They're looking for inspiration. And so I think there's going to be this sort of shift where it's like, oh, do I want to stay home and order in, including dick? You know, do I want to order my Grubhub and then my dick on Grindr? Or do I want to go out to that drag club where I might meet someone? I could see a show, be around people, be around dancing, sweaty bodies. Well, they're going to remember the pandemic. I don't think that it's going to be this other idea, people are going to be afraid to be around people. Oh no, I think as soon as they get that second vaccine and start to get comfortable in a few days around people, they're gonna be whoring it up, you know, at all the clubs. And art, theater, cinema, I think it's all coming back. And we can look at what happened before, what led to the other roaring 20s with another pandemic. Many of the same psychologies that we've been experiencing track completely with what they experienced. So why wouldn't it, you know?
Maybe we'll
I'm an optimist, forgive me.
maybe we'll get some bathhouses back in the city.
Hello, we're allowed to have them now, right? You know.
Yeah, I think something was happening with, like, they were working on something like that.
Supervisor Mandelman was, so there's actually a piece of code that the Department of Public Health passed back during the AIDS crisis that doesn't allow for bathhouses. But Supervisor Mandelman's office and I think Tom Temprano were working on that before the pandemic. I think they kind of took a break from it during the pandemic. But
I thought it happened. I guess I'm mistaken. Well, when it happens, I think Honey needs to have a GoFundMe and she needs to open up a bathhouse called the Honey Hole.
oh my God.
The Honey Hole.
You know what?
Yeah.
Always open. Always open.
Yeah. Always open. Oh my God, the business opportunities, they're endless. Look, this is the future we want in San Francisco. I want to go to the Honey Hole.
Don't forget there's children watching this.
Right. Oh, sorry.
Including my students.
I have another question now. And it actually, so Lunacy was a queer woman's performance space in the late 80s and 90s, and in some ways started to have some early drag king performances. Wondering if the panelists can talk about how drag king performance did or didn't overlap with the history you shared. I also want to add, I think I forgot to add some pictures in here, because there was also some, I don't know if they call it folk queens anymore, but there's also cisgender queens that kind of started to happen towards the end of the last decade.
Well,
and Queen Fatale kind of performs, and San Francisco's really embraced
that actually goes back as far as the Coquettes, you know, Sweet Pam, Fayette. So one of the things that's so great about the San Francisco drag scene are these things that other drag scenes think are weird or anomalies have actually been around forever. So I think Honey and I probably have a very similar experience where when we were introduced into the drag scene here, whether it was through T-Shack or, you know, whatever, it was inclusive of cis women in a way that I never questioned. And there was a time where the cis women did have a pageant called the Folk Queen pageant, and it was a big, big deal. But cis women, animatronic of the Scissor Sisters, you know, L. Ron Hubby, you know, who Kegel Cater, there were a lot of women who did drag king drag, they did femme drag, and they were fully integrated into the scene. And I don't think we thought of them as needing their own community. They were part of the community, you know, they were always part of the community. So people like Lee Crow, who, you know, was very famous for a drag king character called Elvis Herselvis, could also turn around and do full high divine style drag, where because it's Lee Crow, you know, this butch dyke who's so brilliant and so smart, it was ultra confusing to audience members. Like, what is that, you know? Yeah. You know, so I think that is another thing that makes San Francisco drag special. You know, Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, cis women have always been sisters. You know, this thing where there's this divide between cis folks, trans folks, gay men, you know, in other cities where you really see it, especially when you travel. For me, it wasn't, we were always kind of on stage together.
Yeah, same. I don't know that I have much to add to that. I remember one of the first drag performers that I sort of saw and fell in love with was actually Hokumama Swamp, who is of the Moore family, and just would do these like weirdly like sexy, but like also like ridiculous numbers. And I just remember being completely entranced. So for me, I grew up with, drag queens who were cisgendered women and drag kings. And I never thought that there was anything strange about that or new.
Okay, and then I have thank you. And then I have another question to the panel. Is it hard to keep the queer energy in San Francisco as it becomes one of the most expensive cities to live in the world?
Kind of. I mean, I think in some ways, it's not as funky or like sort of ramshackle as I think it used to be. I think that there is a little bit more money and production, maybe because many of the queens who are sort of leading a lot of it now have been around for a while and have, built a following and are able to do productions on a whole nother level, and drag is more popular and there's RuPaul's Drag Race. So like the queer scene has, gotten a little bit more of a spit polish on it than I think it used to. But in some ways it's also more queer because I think as time has gone by, like we are more aware of like, racism and sexism and, all of these things that, as amazing and incredible of a scene as San Francisco has always had, like these things have played a role in, and have been around and a part of those scenes. So I think as we move forward, we're definitely paying attention to that more. I think our spaces are feeling more welcoming to people, whether they're in the Castro or whether they're in Soma or other places. So in that sense, I do think it's more queer, but in the sense of, it feeling a little more raw and edgy, I think it's probably gotten a little bit less queer.
Part of the problem that I've experienced is I moved here after, finishing college, and I had no money. I had no place to live. I had no job. And my parents said, if you go to San Francisco, you are cut off. Don't call us for money, unless it's a plane ticket home, because you're an idiot for doing this, and I was 22 and dumb. And I moved to San Francisco, found an apartment, moved in with roommates, got a shitty job, started performing. And I think that scenario is a lot harder now than it was when I moved to San Francisco in the mid 90s. And I think that's what's affecting the scene is, quite frankly, you want these young people to inspire us old people now. And it's very hard for folks. And with Terror Vault, so many of the actors that work on that show or my Midnight Mass, or, the shows I do at the Castro, so many of them are still young, but the amount of work they have to do to be creative, the hustle they have to do is a lot harder than it was, for my generation. And I think that's really fucked things up, and it's unfortunate. But I'm inspired by how many of them still, commit to doing it. I just wish that, it could be a little bit easier. And so with these rents dropping, I'm actually promoting some of these apartments. I'm finding like, hey, here's really cheap rent in a rent controlled building. Grab it now, because I want the weirdos to come back.
Yeah, no, definitely. I had a coworker say like, oh, I feel bad for you guys because in the 80s we could work at a coffee shop and we could do our own thing, and we had the weekends, and we did all these things, and you guys have to live like 10 people to a house.
Yeah, people would work like 2 days a week and then just do whatever the hell they wanted to.
Yeah, and I think that things like, Sex in the City and things like what was the other one? The one that happened here? We just talked about it. Tales of the City. Kind of a lot of these shows kind of glamorize city life. So then it kind of creates this influx of people, and then people want to live those kind of lives, but then it becomes expensive because everybody wants to live here, and then it kicks out all the weirdos, and then Carol and Karen want to come in because
you know what, I was just thinking like that you can again trace some of this all the way back to the Coquettes who didn't work at all, right. And like you think to yourself, what do you mean you didn't work at all? Not only did they not work at all, they didn't believe in working, and they didn't believe in charging admission for their shows. Like that's, this is how different things have become, right? So it's, you know, and how did they do that? Well, there were government programs that helped, you know, pay for things. You know, I remember once talking to Mink Stoll, the John Waters superstar, about her and Divine coming to San Francisco and working with the Cockettes. And I said, so where did you live? And she was like, oh, either with the Cockettes or you just found a place to live. It wasn't really a big deal. You know, there was always a place to stay. Well, how did you eat if you didn't have a job? You know, how did you pay for things? They would go to this center for people who were unwell mentally, and they would sit there and be basically there all day long because they could get a couple meals, you know? So they would like color and coloring books. And no, I'm not saying this is a good thing to do or the thing that you should do. I'm not saying this is admirable in any way, but you know, they technically were stealing from the taxpayers. I don't know, I'm kind of for it, you know? So you know, it was a very different time when you think about being able to live in San Francisco and not work.
They were subsidizing their art.
Yes,
Their
exactly.
art was San Francisco, their work was San Francisco culture. You know?
Exactly. Yes.
I've got a question for Honey. Can you talk to us a little bit about your work with the Democratic Party? Why did you decide to get involved, and maybe how did you? And maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
I mean, I think my experience with both the Stud and the Transcultural District is really what got me interested in politics and this, you know, problem of displacement that we have been talking about. I was born and raised in San Francisco. I grew up here, and when I started, you know, working in the East Bay as a social worker, I started to see how many people, specifically people of color, specifically poor people, trans people, were people who were living in subsidized housing programs in the city, were, as a process of the city sort of, you know, redeveloping, getting pushed out to the suburbs, to places like Pittsburgh and Antioch, places that are, you know, rural, far removed from any resources, healthcare, places where the KKK is prevalent and they actually have chapters out there, like white supremacist groups, and especially for the trans women who get put out there, like no connection to community, you couldn't get a job because nobody wanted to hire you. You couldn't make your healthcare appointments or anything because there was no public transportation. So people quickly, as a social worker, I would see them decompensate over time. I would see them, you know, resort to, you know, really bad drug addiction and, you know, resort to sex work. And it was a life or death situation. And so that level of displacement like made me think like, well, what's happening in San Francisco? And I realized that there are ways in which we can push back against this, policies that we can pass that could prevent this displacement from continuing. And so I figured it was really important for me to get involved in politics. I first got involved through the Harvey Milk Club. I was its co-president for about a year. And then while I was at the Harvey Milk Club, I got appointed to the San Francisco Democratic County Central Committee. And I really wasn't, you know, I was there to sort of organize community, make sure people were voting, make them aware of the issues, because a lot of times people don't even know like what's on the ballot, you know, or that there is a race that's happening if there isn't a presidential election. And I wasn't really thinking about the Democratic Party at the time because we're in San Francisco and I figure everybody's a Democrat. But what I realized is that in being a part of the Democratic Party, you had a little bit of power in that you got to do create endorsements. And you also had the power of the party to go out and do outreach and register people to vote and really get a chance to communicate with voters in a very direct way. And I think it's really important for us to sort of build the Democratic Party, especially for people who are more progressive, so that we can continue to push the Democratic Party left and really meet the needs of our community. That's my personal opinion. But San Francisco, in a lot of ways, I think, is that voice for the Democratic Party. I mean, San Francisco is one of the most progressive cities in the country. And Nancy Pelosi, right, is the representative from San Francisco. So our party has a lot of power. And with that power, I think we have the opportunity to create great change, not just locally, but actually on a federal level.
Thank you. Yeah. And yeah, Michael and David from the Viersfield tell a story about, well, Michael told a story in my class about unfurling the quilt the AIDS quilt in Washington, D.C., and then grabbing Nancy Pelosi's hand and then being in the first march on Washington, the current march on Washington. So yeah, Nancy Pelosi's,
Not to mention Kamala Harris also.
Right? Hello. Yeah.
But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
And Dianne Feinstein, all people from San Francisco,
Right.
big player in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Thank you. Well, I think if anybody else has a question, I'm going to read one of the, Kylie Manono actually has a question. What's next for you, Honey and Peaches? Oh, I guess she means like, what are you up? What are your next plans or in the future, probably?
Well, for me, I mean, I don't know what's immediately next. I mean, obviously, we're looking for a forever home for the stud. I work as a legislative aide right now, and there's a lot going on. That's sort of like a weird, ambiguous thing, like nobody knows what that is. But basically, I work with the city to write laws and also make sure our constituents are served in the district. And I serve District 6, which includes Soma, the Tenderloin, Rincon Hill, Treasure Island, South Beach, Mission Bay. It's like the richest and poorest of the city. It's really high needs. There's a lot going on there. And so I'm really busy. and also with the Democratic Party as well. We're actually about to have a convention that's coming up in April for the statewide party, and there's a statewide race that's going on right now. So I'm very much participating in that. And I actually have been really enjoying coming and speaking to different schools about the trans district and also about drag. So I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you to Peaches for also including me in this process, because I've hosted one other thing with Peaches like this before, and it's been an absolute blast, and I just have had the best time.
Let's do this again in person. Yeah, thank you so much, Honey. And Peaches, how about you? What's next for you?
Well, I have to say, I can't believe we're all experiencing, or we've passed the collective 1-year anniversary of this whole situation, and it was a year ago in mid-March when I was preparing to do a show at the Castro Theater, and of course it was canceled or postponed, but we still haven't done it, and I don't know when we'll do it, but we will do it. But with this change, basically having my career taken away from me overnight, I had a full calendar in 2020, and I pivoted in a way that I'm actually really grateful for, because part of the success of being able to do shows and tour meant that I wasn't able to do other things. And I know it's like Cry Me a River, but it was sort of this situation where, okay, I haven't been able to work on writing, and I missed writing. So in 2020, I created a TV show pilot with my friend Barla Jean Merman. We finished writing the pilot, and we have the pitch deck out now. And I've written a new feature film with my friend Michael Verratti, and so we're hoping to get that rolling. And created a pitch deck for a documentary series on the history of San Francisco drag. It's called Aggressive Glamour. And so we're pitching that to the streaming services to try to get the story of San Francisco drag out into the world. And I wrote a new show, because realizing I don't think we're going to be back in crammed into big theaters maybe right away. I do think that we could do something like immersive theater. And so I've written a show that's going to take place at the San Francisco Mint, where I do Terror Vault, but this is more fantasy, supernatural. It's called The Immortal Reckoning. And we're opening that show here in San Francisco in early May. So we're back in business, and I've been casting the show, and we're scheduling Zoom rehearsals, and all the actors will wear masks, and the guests will wear masks, and they'll go through the show six people at a time. So it's weird to create theater that's COVID safe, but I'm enjoying the challenge, and I hope people will come out and see the show.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Well, I'm getting my shot on Saturday, so hopefully I'll be ready.
Alexander, how about you? Where can we see your work?
Well, currently I have a show in Chicago at Flex Contemporary. It's a queer gallery, but I'm working on some stuff. I think I applied for a San Francisco Arts Commission grant, and I think it's gonna go well. So hopefully you'll see some work later in the future.
Great.
But yeah, I think we had a pretty good talk, everybody. I think that this is probably a good end to end or shortly after.
Can I just say
Yeah.
one thing? I don't know if
Yeah.
people, when people saw, because I know we're speaking to a lot of artists, but San Francisco is doing a pilot of a universal basic income program for artists, which is up to $1,000 a month. So I think that the city is doing that in partnership with YBCA, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. So definitely look that up and check that out if you're an artist. I definitely would love to see more artists supported here in San Francisco so we can continue to stay here.
Thank you. Yeah.
And then
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much.
Right.
This is fantastic. What a great evening.
Make sure to follow me on Hernalex_art on Instagram, and you can find Honey and Peaches on Instagram too. I think it's just Peaches Christ, right, on Instagram.
The Peaches Christ. Someone took my name, but but I'm verified, so there's a little blue check there.
And then how can we find you on the grams, Honey?
At Honey Mahogany.
Okay, great. Well, make sure to follow us, everybody, and thank you for being with us this evening. Hopefully we can see Honey and Peaches live soon. So take care.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Mwah.
Mwah.
Mwah. Amazing. Good night, everyone. All right. Oh, I hate to press stop, but I'm gonna have to. Good night, everyone. That was so fun. I'll post the recording for. Hi, Josh. We'll post the recording soon, so we'll have, this will be the record of this will be available for CCA folks. All right. Good night.